The first thing Mira Dennett noticed about Ashwell Park was not its towers. It was not the avenue of bare oaks that scraped the January sky like old bones, nor the gray stone facade that rose 4 stories against a pewter afternoon. It was the silence. She had arrived by postchaise at 2:15, her single trunk roped to the back, and her hands folded on her lap with more steadiness than she felt. The driver had not spoken to her since Northampton. The maid hired to accompany her from her aunt's house in Kettering had been collected by a different carriage at the last crossroads, sent elsewhere at someone's instruction, and Mira had not been told whose. She sat very still and watched the park gates open, and she thought that this was what it was to be delivered. The butler who met her at the door was named Fellows. He was perhaps 60, with the colorless precision of a man who had learned long ago that nothing he noticed would surprise him. He took her name. He looked at the card her aunt had pressed into her hand 3 days prior, the card that said companion and named her quarterly wage, and bore a seal she had never thought to question. He handed the card back. "His Grace is not in residence this afternoon," Fellows said. "You will be shown to your rooms. You will not enter the east wing without an escort. You will not open the blue parlor on the 2nd floor. You will not speak to any member of the household about the boy." Mira heard each sentence as if it arrived from a great distance. "What boy?" she said. Fellows looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "The young master, miss. Mr. Tobias. He is 7 years old, and he does not speak." She followed him inside, and the door of Ashwell Park closed behind her. The hall was larger than it appeared from the drive. 2 candelabras burned at the far end, their flames pulled sideways by the draught from the closing door, and the smell of the house came at her all at once, beeswax and cold stone, and, beneath those, something quieter that she could not name, a particular domestic ghost that every large house carries when it has been unhappy for a year. She stood on the black and white marble floor and held her gloves in her hands, and looked at the staircase, rising in 2 clean flights to the left, and she said nothing. If you have ever come to a house and felt the weight of its history settle on your shoulders before you had learned a single name, then you understand how Mira Dennett felt as she walked those corridors for the first time. Stay with me. The reason she had been sent here mattered more than anyone had chosen to tell her. Mira was 23 years old, the daughter of a Northamptonshire clergyman who had died of a fever the previous April, leaving behind him a modest house, a library of sermons, and a debt of £340 to a solicitor in Kettering whose patience had lasted 6 months and no longer. Her mother had died when Mira was 9. She had no brothers. She had one aunt, Mrs. Paris, who managed a draper's shop, and who had received Mira with the particular hospitality of a woman who wished to be kind but could not afford it. Mrs. Paris had found the position at Ashwell Park through a solicitor who knew the steward of the Ashwell estate. Companion was the word they used. What they meant, as Mira came to understand it in those first silent days, was something harder to name. She was to be present. She was to be capable. She was to manage the young master and keep herself unobtrusive and cause no trouble of any kind. 3 previous women had held this position in the 14 months since the late Countess had died. None had stayed longer than 2 months. The household did not explain why. The servants were not unkind to Mira in those first days. They were simply careful. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Caudle, showed her the linen closet and the schoolroom timetable, and the location of the kitchen door with the particular economy of a woman who was conserving her feeling for something more important. Traius. The footman moved past her in corridors without meeting her eyes. The kitchen maid brought her tea each morning and set it down without knocking, as if she were already used to the practice of not expecting. Tobias Ashwell was small for 7 and dark-haired, and he looked at Mira on their first meeting as though she were a coat hung in the wrong place. He sat at the schoolroom table with a piece of paper before him and a pen laid precisely beside it. He did not write. He had not written, Mrs. Caudle had told her, since his mother died. "Good morning," Mira said. He looked at her. She sat down at the table across from him. Not in the tutor's chair which stood at the far end, but in the nearest empty chair, and she took the pen from beside him, and on her own piece of paper she drew a horse, a poor horse. A horse with legs like sticks and a neck that curved in the wrong direction. Tobias did not move for a long time. The schoolroom fire popped once and settled outside the window. The garden was white with frost and perfectly still. She did not look at him. She studied her horse with apparent interest as though assessing whether it could be improved. And she pressed her lips together in the expression of a person dissatisfied with her own work. Then he picked up his own pen and drew a better horse beside hers. And for the first time in Mira Dennett's 14 days at Ashwell Park, something in the house felt as though it breathed. Edward Ashwell, the 5th Earl of Ashwell, returned to the park on a Tuesday evening in late January. While a hard frost was settling over the kitchen garden, he came on horseback and alone, which Mira learned was his habit. He dismissed the groom and stabled his own horse. He came in through the side door rather than the front. Fellows met him in the passage with a lamp and a half-dozen careful sentences about the week's dispatches, and it was in this passage, at this precise moment, that Mira happened to be crossing with a candle in one hand and a book from Tobias's lesson pressed to her chest. She saw the Earl of Ashwell for the first time by lamplight, in a riding coat still damp from the frost, and he saw her, and neither of them spoke. He was 36. Tall and lean, not broad, with the particular posture of a man who has learned that his presence at a doorway stops the room, without any gesture on his part. His face was angular, the jaw precisely set, the dark eyes below heavier brows that had been drawn together, at the moment of their first meeting, into an expression she could not read. Faint scar traced the outer corner of his left eyebrow, thin as a thread, old and pale. His hair was dark and short and slightly disordered from the ride, and he had not yet removed his gloves. He looked at her with an attention so complete and so uninflected that Mira felt as if she had been weighed rather than seen. Then he said, "You are the new one," and turned to speak to Fellows. She had taken 3 steps down the corridor when she heard him say very quietly, in a voice that carried no command and no warmth, and yet somehow carried both, "See that she has a fire in her room tonight. The east corridor is cold." Mira did not turn around. She did not allow herself to wonder what it meant. She walked back to her room and set the candle down, and held both hands flat against the coverlet, until the trembling stopped. The fire was lit within the hour. The household's opinion of the new companion was formed quickly, and stated rarely. To the upper servants, she was polite and careful and kept her station. To the kitchen, she was nothing particular. To Mrs. Caudle, who had arranged the departure of 2 of the 3 prior companions, she was quieter than expected, and less easily frightened than hoped. To Lady Prentice, the Earl's sister-in-law, who arrived on a Friday in early February with her own carriage and her own maid, and an expression of settled authority, she was the hired woman from nowhere. "The Earl requires a woman of family," Lady Prentice said, on the first afternoon of her visit to Mrs. Caudle, in a voice she did not moderate for the corridor. Miss Dennett is a clergyman's daughter, with no connections of use and a dead man's debts. She is not in any practical sense suitable. Mira heard this through the partly open drawing-room door. She stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the schoolroom. Lady Prentice was not the only person who held this view. At the county assembly in Brackley, where Mira accompanied the Earl and Tobias for the purpose of the boy's first social appearance, a Mrs. Blanks, Lofton said, loudly enough to be heard by her neighbor, that the Ashwell household had fallen considerably in its appointments since poor Caroline's day. Her neighbor, a Miss Frome, said nothing at all, but her gaze swept over Mira's dress, which was gray and 4 years old and entirely without ornament, and the sweep itself said everything Mrs. Lofton had left unspoken. She was the woman sold into service where no woman survived. This was what the assembly knew, or thought it knew. What the assembly did not know was what Mira had begun to discover in the particular grammar of Ashwell Park silences. The locked blue parlor on the 2nd floor had not been opened since the Countess died. This Mira understood from the way Mrs. Caudle looked at the door when they passed it, and did not look away quite quickly enough. The east wing, which was also forbidden, contained the late Countess's sitting room, her writing room, and the small room where Caroline Ashwell had sat with her son every afternoon for the 7 months between his birth and the fever that took her when Tobias was 14 months old. Mira did not know this last fact until the 3rd week, when Tobias, who still did not speak, led her to the east wing door and stood before it, with his hand on the door handle and his face turned up at her. She understood what he was asking. She did not open the door. She went instead to find the Earl. This was not done. Companions did not seek audiences with earls. The machinery of the household was arranged precisely to prevent it. She found him in his study, which faced the park to the south. At a desk covered in correspondence, she knocked. He said, "Come." She came in and stood with her hands at her sides and said without preamble, "Tobias wants to go to his mother's room. I think it might help him." The Earl of Ashwell looked up from his desk. He was without his coat. The white cravat was loosened at his throat, the first informality she had seen in him, and something in this informality made the study feel smaller. He looked at her as he had looked at her in the passage on the first evening, that complete attending gaze, and she held it, because she had come with a purpose, and the purpose was the boy. "You have been here 17 days, he said. "Yes," she said. 3 women before you refused to manage Tobias at all." "I am aware of it," she said. A pause. The fire in the study grate shifted. He looked at her for a moment longer, then turned to the window, and the profile of his face, turned against the pale February light, had in it something she had not expected, a particular quality of weight. The jaw was set, as it always was, and the scar at his brow was faint in this light, and he pressed 2 fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose, as if something behind it had begun to ache. "No," he said finally. She left. She did not argue, but the next morning, when she brought Tobias to the schoolroom, the east wing door was standing open. She stood in the corridor and looked at it, and understood that this too was a kind of grammar. He had said no to the request, and yes to the thing beneath the request. The distinction would take her weeks to fully learn. In the drawing room on the evening of Lady Prentice's 3rd day, Mira played the pianoforte. She had not been asked to play. She had simply sat down at the instrument while the dinner guests were assembling in the hall, because Tobias was present, and frightened of the crowd, and she had needed something to put between him and the room's noise. She played a simple air in G major, and Tobias came and stood beside the piano bench in his hand, after a little while, found the edge of the instrument's body, and held it. Lady Prentice entered and saw this, and said from the doorway, in a voice designed to carry, "I was not aware companions entertained." The room heard it. Several of the dinner guests turned. Mira did not stop playing. The Earl of Ashwell, who had entered behind Lady Prentice, said nothing. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room and his hands behind his back, and anyone who had learned to read his silences would have understood that he was angry. Mira had not yet learned. She played the air through to its final bar, and then set her hands in her lap and said, "I apologize if I overstepped," to the middle distance, which was not quite Lady Prentice, and not quite anyone else, and the dinner guests found their places and the moment passed. It was only later, in the passage outside the dining room, that she encountered him. He had sent Lady Prentice ahead with the others. He was alone in the corridor, which was lit by a single lamp on the wall bracket, and smelled of the dinner's candles still trailing their warmth through the cracked door. He had a glass of wine, he had not drunk, and a look on his face she was beginning to recognize as the face he used when something had cost him effort. A muscle at the hinge of his jaw worked once and stopped. The scar at his brow was more visible in lamplight, a fine old line that gave his otherwise composed face a single note of something that had not healed cleanly, and she had stopped herself 3 times in the weeks prior from wondering what had made it. "You play well," he said. "Thank you, my lord. Tobias has not stood that close to another person since the 3rd companion left in October." She said nothing. She waited. "I would not have you apologize for it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his glass. He raised his eyes, found hers, and for a long moment they stood in the lamplit corridor with the sound of the dinner party muffled behind the door. And she was aware of a pull she had no name for, and no business feeling, a warmth that ran from the back of her throat into her hands, and she thought very clearly, no. "Good evening, my lord," she said, and moved past him. The season at Northampton was the territory of Lady Prentice's influence, and Lady Prentice had spent 3 weeks laying the ground for it, with the particular industry of a woman who believes herself to be acting in someone else's best interest, while acting entirely in her own. By March she had installed her niece, Miss Arabella Frome, as the favored guest at 3 Northamptonshire dinner tables, had introduced her to the Earl at no fewer than 5 social occasions, and had made it widely understood among the county families that a match between the Earl of Ashwell and the Frome girl was the sensible resolution to the sad business of poor Caroline. Miss Frome was 21, and pretty and accomplished and entirely without malice. This was what made her presence so difficult. Mira could not dislike her. She watched Arabella sit beside the Earl at the Brackley dinner, and laugh at something he said, which was rare, and the laugh transformed his face in a way Mira had not yet seen, and she thought he looked less like carved stone. She turned her eyes back to Tobias, who sat beside her, and she cut his meat for him, and the conversation at the far end of the table continued without her. "Miss Dennett," Lady Prentice said at the end of the dinner, in a voice that was very kind in pitch and very precise in content, "I wonder if you have given any thought to your future arrangements at Ashwell." The table had mostly emptied. 2 footmen cleared the far end. Tobias had been taken up by the nursery maid 20 minutes prior. Mira was therefore quite alone with Lady Prentice and the candles. "I have not," Mira said. "I ask only because it is my impression that the Earl will soon have less need of a companion for Tobias." Lady Prentice set down her wineglass. "Once the household is properly reconstituted, a new countess will naturally manage the boy's arrangements. The position would not survive such a change." There it was. Mira heard it land with a clarity that surprised her, only in that it had taken this long. "I appreciate your candor," she said. "I am fond of you," Lady Prentice said, "in my way. You are not without qualities. Only the qualities you possess are not the ones required here." She left the table. Mira sat alone in the candlelight for 4 minutes before she trusted herself to stand. It was not grief she felt walking back through the park entrance. It was the specific cold clarity of a woman who has been told the truth about her situation, and who has no argument against any part of it. She was a clergyman's daughter with no connections, and a dead man's debt and a quarterly wage that had not yet put her level with what she owed. She was a woman sold into service where the service was ending. She had known this in some part of herself since the first morning. What she had not expected to know or to feel, as its absence when she imagined it, was the schoolroom. The horse, drawn in ink on rough paper, the east wing door standing open, the particular quality of a corridor at night when the study light came from beneath the door, and she knew he was still working, and the house was not empty of him. She had not expected, when she thought of leaving, that the thing she grieved was a specific square of lamplight under a specific door. She did not allow herself to call this by its true name. She set her hands flat on her coverlet and held them there, and said to herself very quietly, "You are sensible. You have always been sensible. This is not yours." She was very nearly right. The event that changed the shape of things arrived not from within the household, but from outside it, in the form of a letter delivered to the Earl on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of March, which Mira knew about only because Tobias was in the study when it arrived, and she came to collect him for his morning lesson, and saw the Earl read it, and saw his face go still in a way she had not witnessed before. Not the controlled set stillness she knew, but something colder and less managed. She collected Tobias and did not ask. The letter, she learned by evening, was from the late Countess's family solicitor in London. It concerned a document Caroline Ashwell had signed in the year before her death, a deed of trust, naming Tobias's guardianship, in the event of a second marriage by the father, to the late Countess's brother, a Mr. Godfrey Weir of Bath. The document had been held in trust by the solicitor, and had now, following the Earl's informal courtship of Miss Arabella Frome, been made formally active by Weir's written claim. She did not know the specifics. She knew only what Mrs. Sagg Caudle's face told her when she passed the housekeeper in the corridor, and what Fellows's face told her when she collected the evening tray for Tobias, and what the Earl's face told her when she saw him at 8:30 in the lower hall, standing before the hall fireplace with one arm against the mantel. He looked up when he heard her. "I thought you had retired," he said. "I came for Tobias's book," she said. It was not entirely untrue. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, as though the decision had been made several sentences before he spoke it, he said, "Sit down, Miss Dennett." She sat. He poured her a glass of wine she had not asked for, and set it on the small table at her elbow. He did not pour one for himself. He turned back to the fireplace, and after a moment he said, in the voice he used when the words were precisely chosen, "Caroline believed I was not capable of raising him. She may have been right." Mira kept her hands folded in her lap. The fire was the loudest thing in the room. "She was dying," he said. "She had been ill for 6 weeks, and she had not slept, and she was frightened." He turned the letter in his hand without looking at it. "She signed the document on a Thursday. She was gone by the following Sunday. I did not know the document existed until this morning." He said it without excess. He said it with the controlled flatness of a man who had learned very early that volume was not the same as feeling, and who had paid a high price for the lesson. Mira understood for the first time the full structure of what she had called coldness. It was not coldness. It was the particular posture of a man who had been handed grief in the shape of duty and had carried it in both hands without putting it down. "She was right to be frightened," he said after a silence. "I was present and I was useless, and I could not find my way through it. Tobias does not speak because I did not speak to him. Not in the way that counted." Mira picked up the glass of wine and held it in both hands and did not drink from it. She looked at the fire. Outside the windows the park was full of darkened frost, and the bare oaks scraped the sky. "He speaks now," she said. "In the only language he has." He turned to look at her. "The horses," she said. "The drawings. When he leads you to the kitchen garden because he wants the rosemary plant to have water. When he picks up your hat from the hall table and brings it to you on a cold morning." She kept her voice very level. "That is, language. It was always language. You have been answering it for weeks." He was quiet for a long time. "I did not know you had noticed," he said. She should have said something careful, something appropriate to her station, and the hour and the particular danger of a lamplit room and a man's voice gone low. She said instead simply, "I notice everything." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something not guarded and not performative, a look that was almost plain in its feeling, and for one moment the full weight of it met her before she could prepare for it, and her chest was very warm and very frightened, and very still all at once. Then he straightened. He folded the letter and set it in his coat pocket. The guard came back, not entirely, but enough. "I have an appointment in London next week," he said, "to contest the document. I will need someone to remain with Tobias." "Of course," she said. She rose. She said good night. She walked to the door, and her hand was on the doorframe when he said her name, not Miss Dennett, her name, Mira, and the sound of it in his voice was so precise and so entirely deliberate that she stopped. "I will not lose him," he said. The words were very quiet. They were also absolute. She turned far enough to look back. He was still at the fireplace, his hand now resting flat on the mantel, his face half in shadow and half in firelight, and she thought she had never seen a person look so plainly in need of being believed. "I know," she said. She meant it. She went to bed. The London trip took 9 days. Mira knew this because she counted them, and each day had a distinct texture, and the first 3 were Tobias in the schoolroom and the kitchen garden, and the careful ordinary fabric of a house without its master. The fourth was a letter from the Earl to Fellows, businesslike and brief, which Fellows did not share with her, but which changed something in the housekeeper's posture toward a cautious optimism. The fifth and sixth days were Lady Prentice, who arrived uninvited and took up residence in the yellow guest room, and spent those 2 days managing the household's opinion of the pending situation. "If Weir succeeds in his claim," Lady Prentice said on the 6th day to Mrs. Caudle, in the passage outside the morning room, "the household will require considerable restructuring. It is not impossible that the Earl would withdraw from Northamptonshire entirely for a period." A pause, measured and precise. A companion, in such circumstances, would be the first economy. Mrs. Caudle did not respond. On the 7th day, Tobias found the key. Mira did not know what the key was for until he carried it to her, held flat in both palms, with the careful solemnity of a child presenting something important. It was old and brass, and the bow was shaped like a small leaf. She recognized it as the key that hung on the peg inside the late Countess's writing room in the East Wing, the room they had been to twice since the door first opened, the room where the shelves held Caroline Ashwell's letters and her music books and a portrait, turned face inward, on the small writing desk. The portrait was of a woman she had not dared turn forward. She had always known it was there, and had not touched it. Tobias set the key in her hand and pointed at the writing-room door, which was closed. She went with him. She opened the door. She let him lead her to the desk. He pointed at the portrait, still facing, the painted edge of a gilded frame, and the brown canvas backing, and he looked at her. She turned it. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 28, with dark hair, and a direct expression, and a kind of face that had known how to be still. She held nothing. She sat in a garden chair, at the lower edge of the frame, barely visible. The painter had included one small detail: a pale yellow rosemary flower laid on the arm of the chair, which was not in bloom in the month the portrait was dated. Tobias touched the frame with one finger. "She put rosemary in the kitchen garden," Mira said very softly. "Is that why you water it?" He looked at her. He nodded once. She held both her arms open. He came into them and she held him. This small, quiet boy, who had been keeping faith with his mother in the only language available to him, and she felt the weight of him against her shoulder, and thought, "You are the whole reason I am still in this house." She held him until the cold in the writing room grew noticeable, and then she closed the portrait's face again, and they went out, and she locked the door and kept the key. The Earl returned on the 9th evening. She heard the side door, and the low voices of Fellows, and the particular silence that settled after him when the household registered that he was back. She waited. She did not go down. He came to the schoolroom at 8:30. Tobias had been in bed for an hour. She was reading by the schoolroom fire, the candle low, the book no longer entirely absorbing her attention. He knocked. He came in without waiting for a reply, as though the knock were courtesy and the entry were already decided. "The document has been set aside," he said. She set the book down. "We're signed under incorrect witness," he said. A flaw the solicitor did not catch, and my own man found in an afternoon. He crossed to the window, looked at the dark park for a moment, then turned. The firelight was on the side of his face, and the scar at his brow was faintly warm in it. "Tobias stays." "I am glad," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with the directness that was no longer alarming, the directness she had by now catalogued as his particular idiom, of honesty. "You did not leave while I was gone. I had no reason to leave," she said. "Tobias needed me here." "Only Tobias," he said. It was not quite a question. She felt the precision of it land somewhere in the region of her sternum, and her hands tightened briefly on the book's cover. "My lord," she said carefully. "No." He took a step away from the window. "Not tonight. Not in this room." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. "I have been very careful for a long time, to give you every reason to see this position as temporary. I told myself it was for your sake, that I was protecting you from an attachment that could not go anywhere." He looked at his hands. I was also protecting myself. The room was very still. I was told in London by my solicitor that Lady Prentice has been corresponding with a family in Somerset on your behalf. A domestic position. One she arranged without your knowledge. Mira sat very quietly with this information. She wished to be kind, he said. She thought she was solving a problem. Yes, Mira said. I did not wish her to solve it. He looked at her directly. I did not want you placed in Somerset. She stood. Ah. She did not know why she stood, except that the conversation had arrived at a place where she could not receive it sitting down. She set the book on the chair. You have never once said anything to suggest, she began. I know, he said. I know, I said nothing. I gave you commands, and I lit fires, and I left doors open, and I said nothing in plain language. The words came levelly, but the effort behind them was visible for once. My wife believed I was not capable of it. Of the thing I am trying to do now, of speaking plainly, before it was too late. Mira looked at him. She thought of the portrait in the writing room and the face that had known how to be still. She thought of Tobias in the kitchen garden with the watering can, keeping faith. What is it you are trying to do now? She said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of it. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped before her, close enough that the warmth of him was entirely present, and he said, without any inflection, except the one that was simply true, I'm asking you to stay. She looked at him. His face was entirely open, in a way she had never seen and would remember for the rest of her life. The guard, not down, but simply absent, the jaw still precise, and the scar faint, and the dark eyes looking at her with something she had been refusing to name for 8 weeks. Tobias will need me, she said, not looking away. Yes, he said. He did not look away either, and so will I. The morning after was very quiet. This was deliberate, she thought. He was not a man who trafficked in excess, and what had passed between them in the schoolroom had been sufficient. There was no announcement, there was no formal declaration before the household. There were only, in the days that followed, small things. He walked beside her in the kitchen garden on the mornings when the ground was hard and the breath came visible in the air between them, and he did not touch her. And the not touching was its own language by now, a kind of grammar she had learned to read as clearly as his commands. He came to the schoolroom without pretext. He sat at the opposite end of the dining room with Tobias between them, and looked down the length of the table at her as if she were already in the room he had always meant to keep. Twice, in the evenings, she heard him play the pianoforte. He played badly, and did not know she could hear him from the passage. Lady Prentice departed on a Tuesday with a remark to Mrs. Caudle about imprudence that found no audience willing to receive it. Miss Arabella Frome had, as it happened, accepted a proposal from a young baronet in Leicestershire 3 days prior, and the match had been widely approved. This fact was discussed by several of the county families at some length. The Earl's name was not attached to any disappointment. The public occasion came in April, at the Northampton Assembly, which was smaller and more provincial than the London rooms, but which served its purpose perfectly. Mira wore a dress that was not grey. She had not bought it. She had found it, wrapped in brown paper, on the chair of her room on the morning of the assembly, without note or signature. It was the color of cream and the cut was entirely correct. And she stood before her glass for a long time before she put it on. At the assembly, Mrs. Ponning Lofton said, within clear hearing of 2 adjacent matrons and a young woman Mira did not recognize, that it was curious how some women found their way into positions of advantage entirely through proximity, and nothing more. Miss Prentice, Lady Prentice's own daughter, who was standing 3 feet away and had, over the past 2 months, formed a quietly settled opinion of her own, said that she had heard Miss Dennett speaks French and Italian, and plays tolerably. I had also heard she is the first person Tobias Ashwell has spoken to in over a year. Which of those qualities exactly are you calling proximity? Mrs. Lofton. Mrs. Lofton did not answer. The Earl arrived late, as was his occasional custom. He moved through the room with his characteristic economy. nodding to the men who addressed him, not pausing for conversation, until he reached the point where Mira stood at the edge of the floor. He stopped. He offered her his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was entirely serious, as always, but at the corner of his mouth there was something that in another man might have been amusement. The rarest possible expression on him, and its rarity made it the most valuable thing in the room. She took his hand. "They will talk," she said quietly. "For only him. They have always talked," he said. "Now they will be accurate." He led her onto the floor, and the Northampton Assembly, which had talked about the Ashwell household in various configurations for 14 months, arranged itself around them and watched, and the watching was not cruel but corrective, the kind of watching that knows when it has been wrong, and Mira Dennett, who had been sold into service, and had survived and had found something no one had promised her, held his hand and did not look at the room. She looked at him. In October, when the kitchen garden had gone dormant, and the rosemary was cut back to its woody stalks, and the park was filling again with the particular coppery light of late autumn, Tobias Ashwell spoke for the first time. He spoke in the kitchen garden, early in the morning, before the household was awake, while Mira was cutting back the herbs with a small knife, and Tobias was beside her with the watering can, which he carried out of habit even in autumn when there was nothing to water. He said, "She would have liked you." The knife stopped. Mira looked at him. He was looking at the rosemary, which was brown and silver and would come back in spring. She was quiet for a long time. The frost had not arrived yet, though it was coming. The air smelled of cut herbs and cold soil and very faintly of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. "I hope so," she said finally. "I would have liked her." He nodded. He set the watering can down on the path and took her free hand, and they stood together in the kitchen garden, while the light came up over Ashwell Park, and the rosemary held its dry, quiet shape against the cold. And inside the house a fire was being lit in the study, and a door was standing open. And the key with the leaf-shaped bow hung again on its peg in the east wing, where a portrait faced forward, now a woman in a garden with a pale rosemary flower on the arm of her chair, presiding over all of it calmly. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments below. It is enough, sometimes, to simply say that you were here. The frost came that afternoon, as it had been coming, and the park went white and still, and in the schoolroom window there was a small drawing pinned to the frame, a horse with stick legs, and a neck that curved the wrong way, beside a better horse in a steadier hand, and neither was alone.